America was not prepared for such a blow. Factories are closing, workers are losing their jobs, car prices are skyrocketing. This isn't just an economic crisis, it's a full-blown disaster.
There is a roller coaster happening with regard to the tariffs. Those 25% tariffs that the president slapped on Canada and Mexico on Monday, well, those are apparently not happening, at least when it comes to to Mexico and not Canada. He is reversing some of them, at least.
President Trump recently announced stiff tariffs on imports from Mexico in an attempt to force the neighboring country to make concessions. But instead of complying, Mexico struck back. In an instant, the entire supply chain of the U.S. auto industry collapsed. Ford, GM, Tesla plants are on the verge of shutting down. In Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, thousands of workers are furloughed.
You're standing outside the White House, you're on the North Lawn. Can you give us any sense of what all this means?
Dana, if there's any question of why the market has been so confused and rattled in recent days, I think the events of the last really hour sum it up quite perfectly, and certainly of the last month. The president often threatens tariffs. This time he went through with tariffs, and now we are learning that he is pulling back those tariffs. Let's start with Mexico.
The stock market is crashing, car dealerships are emptying, and buyers are panicking. This is the largest auto industry crisis in 50 years. How far will this conflict go? Will America be able to withstand this blow? Or is this the end of an era of U.S. world leadership? Everything you need to know about the most destructive trade confrontation of the decade right now. President Trump announced stiff tariffs on imports from Mexico, assuring that it would help bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and create hundreds of thousands of jobs. He argued that for decades the U.S. economy had suffered from unfair trade, and it was time to take back control. However, no one expected Mexico's backlash to be so devastating. In an instant, the entire well-established system of supplying automobile components, built over decades, began to collapse like a house of cards.
Or maybe he won't take them away. We still are not clear, beyond what he posted about Mexico, what that means for Canada and beyond. Jeff, thank you so much. The uncertainty is not confined to Pennsylvania Avenue. Business leaders from Wall Street to Main Street are definitely feeling it too. I want to go right now to Matt Egan.
At first glance, the decision to impose tariffs seemed like a logical step. America had been dependent on cheap labor in Mexico for years, and the White House decided to use economic pressure to force the neighboring country to renegotiate trade terms. What policymakers in Washington failed to take into account, however, was the depth of the U.S. auto industry's dependence on Mexican supplies. Nearly 40% of all auto parts used in U.S. factories came from abroad, and a significant portion came specifically from Mexico. These are not just nuts and bolts, they are complex electronic systems, transmissions, engines, and other critical components, without which car production is impossible. Mexico did not hesitate to respond. Almost immediately after Trump's announcement, the country's government announced that it was imposing a ban on exports of a number of key auto components to the United States. It was an unprecedented decision, comparable to an economic embargo. In a matter of days, the assembly lines of America's largest automakers began to slow down and then stopped altogether. Plants in Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles were paralyzed. General Motors and Ford managers called emergency crisis meetings trying to find a way out, but in reality there were few options. Automotive production is a highly complex system in which any slowdown in one area instantly sets off a chain reaction throughout the industry. Workers began receiving notices that their contracts were being suspended. Many had hoped to the last minute that the government would quickly reach a deal with Mexico and production would resume, but it didn't happen. Every week lost cost the industry billions of dollars. Auto dealers reported that deliveries of new cars had plummeted, and car prices began to rise by the hour, not by the day. In some cities, the cost of cars soared 30% in just a few weeks. Car dealership owners tried to explain to customers that the problem was not theirs. There were simply no more new cars in the country.
Who has been talking to those business owners. And Matt, it is not a coincidence that Howard Lutnick went on a business network to say these are perhaps not going to happen now. a business network that everybody who is on Wall Street watches.
At the same time, the stock market began to boom. Shares of major automakers plummeted, and investors sold off securities in panic, expecting an even bigger crisis. Banks that were financing the auto industry began to raise interest rates to minimize their risks, which only aggravated the situation. One of the largest automobile electronics manufacturers in the U.S. announced that it had to cut nearly 20,000 jobs as production without supplies from Mexico became impossible. Meanwhile, Mexico has taken a tough stance, saying it will not return supplies until the White House lifts the tariffs. The country's president called Trump's decision an attack on the Latin American economy and emphasized that his country would no longer play the role of a cheap workshop for U.S. corporations. Moreover, Mexico began looking for new markets, negotiating with China and EU countries to redirect export flows. Inside the U.S., tensions were rising. Workers who had recently supported Trump's policies began to take to the streets in protests. In Detroit, the rallies reached such a scale that the authorities had to block several central streets. People demanded their jobs back, but it was not so easy to do. Factories stood idle, parts warehouses were empty, and the situation in the economy was heating up every day.
It seems to me that what he was trying to do was to help correct the markets, which are totally confused and worried. And we all know that confusion is not a place that the market wants to be. And we also know that the markets are an indicator of an economy that President Trump has historically been very, very keen to watch.
Some experts assumed that the problem would be solved quickly. Supposedly, American factories would simply start producing spare parts domestically. But this turned out to be utopia. The production lines that could replace the Mexican capacity were either long outdated or required huge investments. Just to retool one Ford plant in Ohio required more than $4 billion and at least 2 years of work. This was unacceptable in the crisis, when each day of downtime cost hundreds of millions of losses. Individual manufacturers tried to look for alternative suppliers in Canada, South Korea, and Japan, but logistics were so complicated and expensive that no one could completely replace Mexico. Companies were faced with the fact that many specialized production facilities that developed unique parts existed only in Mexico. For example, the manufacturer of fuel pumps for Tesla was the only one in the world that could produce the necessary parts in such volumes, and its factory was located in Monterrey. A month after the crisis began, it became clear that the consequences could be much more serious than expected. Once prosperous automobile cities had become economic disaster zones. In Michigan, unemployment rose 15% in a month, and in parts of Ohio, the numbers reached record highs since 2008. People were not only losing their jobs, but also their homes because they couldn't make their mortgage payments. A wave of bankruptcies swept through small businesses tied to the auto industry, rubber suppliers, logistics companies, transportation firms. Some political analysts have started talking about how this crisis could cost Trump his re-election. His economic policies, which he positioned as a defense of American workers, have backfired on those workers themselves. The White House was trapped. Conceding to Mexico would mean admitting failure, and continuing to push for tariffs meant further escalation and more layoffs. Amid this chaos, rumors of secret negotiations between Washington and Mexico City multiplied. Allegedly, representatives of major auto companies were pressuring both sides for an urgent solution, threatening mass plant closures. Some said that Canada had offered to mediate the talks, but there was no reliable confirmation of this. While politicians and corporations tried to find a way out, ordinary Americans were held hostage to the situation. Families of workers who had been laid off didn't know how to pay their bills. Stores recorded a sharp drop in consumer spending. Some gas stations began to close as sales of new cars fell, and thus the demand for fuel decreased. This crisis was a lesson to all who thought that in the modern world it was possible to destroy established trade relations with impunity. The U.S. auto industry, which for decades had relied on cheap components from abroad, now faced reality. There was no alternative to Mexico. And the question was not who would win this economic conflict, but how badly it would destroy the U.S. economy before a solution was found.
Yeah, that's right, Dana. Look, business owners, CEOs, investors, they crave stability. But what we're getting right now is a whole lot of uncertainty and frankly chaos, right? It feels like each week or maybe even each hour, there's new tariffs that are threatened, right? Some of them kick in, some of them are pulled back at the last moment after a very good phone call.
The economic response to Mexico's countermeasures was far more swift and devastating than could have been predicted. The U.S. auto industry was set up in such a way that any delays in supply instantly had a cascading effect throughout the production chain. Now, when critical parts and assemblies stopped arriving, the chain collapsed not gradually, but almost instantaneously, like a domino effect. Just-in-time factories had no stock to compensate for the sudden interruption of supply, which meant that the process of assembling machines stopped within days, sometimes even hours. A week after the first disruptions, the largest U.S. automakers announced the temporary suspension of work at a number of plants. Following them, the supplying companies, which could not sell components that were not in demand under the current conditions, found themselves in a critical situation. The economic impact was swift and devastating. Assembly lines in Detroit, Chicago, Texas, and Ohio, dependent on the daily supply of parts, came to a halt almost simultaneously. Ford, General Motors, Tesla, and Stellantis faced not just parts shortages, but complete supply chain paralysis. At one GM plant in Michigan alone, nearly 4,000 cars were idled and could not be assembled due to a lack of electronic control units shipped from Puebla, Mexico. At another Ford plant, thousands of F-150 pickup trucks, fully ready to roll off the assembly line, stood without engines because the engines were sourced exclusively from Guanajuato. In total, more than 200,000 vehicles in production were hanging on indefinitely. One of the largest distributors of automotive parts in the U.S., specializing in supplies for service centers, reported that its inventory was critically low, and it could no longer supply the parts to repair the cars. In major cities across the country, such as New York and Los Angeles, car repair centers began refusing to repair customers as parts ran out and no new deliveries were expected in the coming months. Car owners faced an unexpected problem. Even the usual replacement of brake pads or alternator became impossible, and the remaining in-stock parts soared in price several times. Smuggled parts, supplied through illegal channels from Mexico, began to appear on the black market, but their cost was absurd. The largest car companies, realizing the scale of the problem, tried to urgently organize alternative supplies, but it was impossible to reconfigure logistics in the shortest possible time. A contract with factories in China or South Korea could only partially solve the problem, as it took 6 to 10 weeks for components to be delivered by sea, which was unacceptable for an industry operating in a minimum stock regime. Canada, which also had well-developed automotive component plants, found itself in the same situation, as part of its capacity depended on raw material supplies from Mexico. Meanwhile, dealerships across the country began to record a sharp rise in car prices. What had cost $40,000 a month ago was now selling for $60,000 or even $70,000. Some buyers, fearing further price increases, hastily bought up the remaining cars in stock, exacerbating the crisis. In some states, there was unrest among cab and delivery drivers who needed to upgrade their fleets. But because of the lack of new cars, they were forced to continue using old cars, which increased their repair and fuel costs. Car sharing and car rental companies faced an even bigger problem. They were unable to renew their fleets, and demand for rentals soared, making it almost impossible to find a car for rent in major cities. The stock market, already beginning to come under pressure after the first reports of supply disruptions, entered a phase of panic. Shares of Ford and General Motors lost about 45% of their value in 3 weeks, and Tesla went into a tailspin as its plant in Texas became the most vulnerable due to its dependence on battery supplies from Mexico. The markets reacted predictably. Investors got rid of shares of car companies, which intensified the crisis, leading to the loss of billions of dollars of capitalization. However, workers in the auto industry were hit the hardest. While earlier layoffs had been spotty and affected only a few companies, now the situation was threatening the entire industry. In Ohio alone, more than 50,000 jobs were announced to be cut. In Detroit, thousands of employees were faced with the choice of accepting forced furloughs without pay or looking for new jobs. Small and medium-sized companies that worked in conjunction with the automobile industry were on the verge of bankruptcy. In response to the worsening crisis, the White House announced the start of negotiations with Mexico, but their start only made matters worse. U.S. officials expected the Mexican government to make concessions, afraid of large-scale losses, but this did not happen. Moreover, the Mexican side said it would now demand compensation for the economic losses caused by the blocked shipments, in addition to the elimination of U.S. tariffs. The announcement sparked a wave of outrage in Washington. Some senators called for retaliatory measures, including a complete halt to cooperation with Mexican suppliers. However, the business community was strongly opposed to such a move, realizing that without Mexican parts it was impossible to restore automobile production in the United States. Internal pressure on the Trump administration was building up. Labor unions, which had previously supported his economic course, now demanded an immediate resolution of the crisis. Protests were held in several states, and automakers began to publicly pressure the government, threatening to move production to other countries if the situation was not resolved as soon as possible. Major companies began to consider moving some of their facilities to Brazil and Argentina, which only added to the instability in the economy. Against the background of these events, the U.S. was faced with a difficult choice: either to make concessions, recognizing defeat in the economic confrontation, or to continue pressure on Mexico, risking a complete collapse of the automotive industry. The crisis has already gone beyond an ordinary trade conflict. It has begun to transform into the biggest economic crisis of recent decades. Each subsequent action by one side has only exacerbated the situation, bringing the U.S. closer to the point of no return, when industry recovery could take years rather than months. The effects of the Mexican backlash quickly spread beyond the auto industry, spreading throughout the U.S. economy at an alarming rate. As major factories shut down and supply chains collapsed, the stock market went from anxious to panic. Investors, already worried about falling stocks of automakers, now began dumping securities of companies somehow related to the auto industry. Steel and aluminum companies were under extreme pressure as demand for their products plummeted. Those who relied on orders from Ford, General Motors, and Tesla began to urgently revise budgets, expecting multi-billion-dollar losses. Shares of major logistics corporations working with the auto industry began to lose value rapidly as trucking volumes between the US and Mexico plummeted. The Dow Jones Stock Index lost more than 1,000 points in a single day, the largest collapse in a decade. Economists began to draw parallels with the 2008 crisis, pointing out that the situation follows a similar scenario: first problems in one industry, then a chain reaction throughout the economy. Major investment banks, such as JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, lowered their forecasts for US GDP growth, warning clients of a possible recession. At this time, private investors panicked and withdrew money from the markets, fearing further declines. The problems in the auto industry hit not only the industry but also ordinary Americans. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs or were forced to take unpaid vacations, causing consumption levels to plummet. Retailers and shopping centers began to record a drop in sales as people began to save money, fearing instability. Banks reported a rise in unpaid loans, especially among families who worked in the auto industry. In states where auto manufacturing was a large part of the economy, such as Michigan and Ohio, massive mortgage payment delays began, and the real estate market was threatened. The political pressure on the Trump administration intensified by the day. While previously the White House could afford to ignore the protests of workers or the appeals of businessmen, now the crisis has taken on a scale that threatens the entire country. Senators and congressmen from the affected states have begun to openly oppose the president's trade policies, demanding immediate negotiations with Mexico. Even those politicians who previously supported Trump's tough economic strategy have now realized that the situation is out of control. The White House was faced with a difficult dilemma. Canceling the tariffs meant political defeat. Continuing the conflict meant deepening the economic catastrophe. At this time, the situation on the border with Mexico heated up. Truck drivers engaged in international transportation went on strike, demanding an urgent solution to the problem. Tens of thousands of containers of goods were stuck at checkpoints as Mexican authorities imposed additional inspections, making trade more difficult. U.S. companies that depend on shipments of not only auto parts but also food, electronics and building materials began to feel the shortage of goods. In California and Texas, prices of fruits and vegetables began to skyrocket as much of it came from Mexico. In response to the growing protests, the presidential administration tried to show toughness by announcing the possible imposition of additional tariffs on Mexican goods. However, this move only exacerbated the situation. Mexico immediately announced that in case of further escalation, it would impose retaliatory duties on U.S. agricultural products, which jeopardized farmers who exported goods to the South. U.S. farmer associations began to openly oppose Trump, saying his policies were destroying their businesses. In the midst of this crisis, diplomatic talks between Washington and Mexico City began. However, the first rounds of meetings did not lead to any results. Mexico took a tough stance, demanding the complete elimination of tariffs, while the White House insisted on renegotiating trade agreements in its favor. Meanwhile, U.S. producers tried to find a way out of the situation, investing millions of dollars in finding alternative suppliers. But experts warned that it was impossible to replace Mexico in the supply chain in a short time, and any solution that would minimize the effects of the crisis would take several years. The crisis in the automobile industry led to another unexpected effect: an increase in criminal activity. In major American cities, police began to record an increase in car thefts and auto thefts. As car prices soared, criminal groups began to use this factor to enrich themselves quickly. In California and Illinois, there were mass cases of new cars being stolen directly from trucks that were supposed to deliver them to dealerships. Illegal workshops began to appear in some areas, engaged in dismantling cars for parts and selling them on the black market. As a result of all these events, the level of confidence in the president's economic policy was falling rapidly. According to polls, more than 70% of Americans believed that the imposition of tariffs on Mexican goods was a mistake that led to devastating consequences. Even among Trump's supporters, discontent was growing, with many of them working in factories now idle due to parts shortages. At the same time, the Mexican government's domestic ratings were soaring. The Mexican president had become a symbol of resistance to American economic pressure, and his tough stance in trade negotiations brought him additional support among the population. The most troubling prospect, however, was that the crisis could develop into a long-term problem that would leave a mark on the U.S. economy for years to come. Even if the White House decided at that point to cancel the tariffs, the damage done could no longer be compensated for instantly. Production chains that had been disrupted for weeks could not be rebuilt in a matter of days. Thousands of laid-off workers were already looking for new jobs. And even if the factories restarted, it would be almost impossible to get all the employees back. Predictions began to emerge among experts that the crisis in the automotive industry could be the beginning of a new wave of deindustrialization in the United States. Some companies have already started to consider moving production abroad to avoid similar situations in the future. Even if the conflict was resolved, business confidence in the stability of U.S. trade policy was undermined. All these events showed how fragile the economy of even such a powerful country as the United States can be if one strategic partner decides to strike back. There were no winners in this confrontation. Both sides suffered enormous losses. But if for Mexico it was a matter of national dignity, for the U.S. the consequences could be much more devastating. Politicians, businessmen, investors all now look to the White House in anticipation of the next move. Any mistake could cost America an even bigger crisis, and possibly the loss of global economic leadership.